Good evening, Mwangi, and thank you very much for giving me time to talk to the Mint while you're over here in Oxford. To start with, I'd like to begin by asking you to give us some examples of positive stories of development in Africa, because I suppose we get told so often that bad news about Africa.
Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Let me just take a second to step back from, instead of immediately going to the positive stories, but to kind of offer a corrective on what we're often told about Africa. I think often we think of Africa in terms of Africa or African economies more correctly as failing economies. But there's actually been three distinct phases of African growth since independence. And the first 10 or so years, so if you think from a roughly 1960 to about 73, was a positive epoch, positive era of growth, one which has barely been repeated in this most recent period of growth. And then we had a slowdown.
So can I just ask you, so that early period,
yeah,
what were the bits, what were the areas of the economy which were growing? Are we talking agriculture, or was it also industry, or what?
No, in fact, that's when African manufacturing grew the fastest.
Okay.
So it was a period in which African manufacturing grew the fastest. If I remember, you know, we have roughly, for the countries that we have data, about 7% growth in value-added terms for manufacturing during that period. So
was this sort of was this doing the sort of things that more recently China has done in terms of mass production or heavy industry? Are we talking heavy industry?
It was a lot more import substituted industrialization,
right?
Which was what was being done and what was in at the time, more than anything else. So it was often production for African home markets.
Okay.
That was growing, and that grew, you know, really rapidly. I remember growing up in this period, and you know, always watching the announcements of the new factory doing this or the other. So that was a period of actually a very interesting period in African growth, and where much of even today's present African industrial capacity was created.
Wow.
In fact, in the period after that, which is I see as the second period, which is, let's say, post, you know, around 1980, beginning about 1980 to about 1995, which is a period in which neoliberalism is implemented, structural adjustment programs are put in place. That was a period which is characterized by negative per capita growth for African economies, and also a period in which we have deindustrialization of the little bit. So you move from roughly just above 10%, maybe 13%, and drop to about 9% in terms of the share of industry for African countries.
And in between those two periods, was there a sort of debt crisis that led to the sort of structural industrial?
So it wasn't so much a debt crisis as a current account, you know, a trade deficit issue. You know, initially, so around 1974, African countries, I think only now present day Congo Democratic Republic, Zaire, then Zaire, only Zaire had borrowed on the international markets at that time.
Okay.
So in fact, African countries were not heavily indebted, at least to the international market, to private lenders. But they were subject to the same conditions that Latin American countries were, which were much more heavily indebted to the private markets.
And why was that? Why were they hit by the same conditions?
Because one size fits all for the Bretton Woods institutions, right? Structural adjustment tended to be one size fits all, and rather than taking into account specific conditions.
But I thought normally that was because, well, the Bretton Woods institution, when they had the leverage, because they did that, but where was their leverage in this situation? Why didn't the African countries just ignore them?
So that's a really interesting question. So there were some countries that ignored them and did quite well during the period. You know, interestingly, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, between 1980 and 1989, pretty ignored adjustment conditions and did quite well. Grew rapidly. Agriculture grew very fast. Smallholders increased their output by nearly tenfold during that period, and they did quite well.
Yeah.
Why did they ignore them? I think there are a couple of reasons. One, the trade deficit was real, right? The trade deficit was real, and African countries needed a way to finance their imports.
Okay.
So with the oil crisis, they were in that sense cornered, and they had to finance their imports. Two, along the way, African countries lost leverage towards the end of this period with the end of the Cold War.
Right. Right. Okay.
Right. So I think the Cold War often gave African countries leverage in the sense that the people were much less inclined to implement harsher conditions, because then a country may change sides.
Okay.
You have the interest in Ethiopia and Somalia, for example, keep switching sides. You know, one switches to the US, the other switches to the USSR, and vice versa, right? So a regional struggles also are reflected in kind of the global Cold War. So I think that's another important aspect of it. The third is something we're less comfortable speaking about, but is our, how shall I put this? Our succumbing, this will sound harsh, but our succumbing to white supremacy, in the sense that post 70s, I would say that the inculcation of a kind of hierarchy in terms of knowledge creation had been imposed on both African intellectuals and African policymakers writ large, where we turned to the West for advice.
So there was a lack of self-confidence.
There was a complete lack of self-confidence. And so, you know, the West was always better. And this remains till, in many ways, till today. And so that also contributed to the picking up of structural adjustment ideas, etc. So those three things, along with, you know, real issues, kind of the limits that the policies that some African countries had followed faced, made it difficult to chart an alternative path.
So we now move forward. What's the next phase then?
Then the next phase. So that first phase is a growth phase to somewhere between 74 and 80. Then the next is the negative growth phase to about 95. Then 95 forward is a positive growth phase in terms of income per capita. Up till more recently, it slowed down more recently, but it was quite high recently.
And what triggered the next? What changed things to move to this next phase in 95?
At some level, there was some correction. I think between the first phase and the third phase, in the first phase, I think there were some countries that did get some things wrong. So, for example, I think in some instances, the role the market played was relatively limited in the first phase for many countries. And so some of the opening up did have positive effects in the last phase. So that's internally. On the external, it is also the case that the first phase was dominated by high prices, high commodity prices, primary commodity prices, as has been this last phase. So in the first phase, we're talking about the post-Korean War boom globally. And this last phase, we're talking about the Chinese and Indian boom, which have also resulted in a high demand for primary commodities, both agricultural and mineral.
And this is good for Africa.
This has been good for Africa, which has remained a primary producer. So there's a little bit of both. There's the primary commodity booms, but this is not to put aside that there has been a change in kind of economic thinking that I think in this latter phase, maybe the economy has actual attempts at economic management may have been more serious than the first phase, where Africa lacked the capacity. In many ways, it had vision. African economies had vision, but lacked capacity in the first phase.
What do you mean by capacity, right?
So actually, trained economists.
Yeah.
So there weren't that many trained economists at that time. Many, you think of Tanzania, which had, remember the number was something like 6 university graduates at independence.
Right.
I think Congo is worse. So, just that alone becomes an issue. In the latter phase, there are a lot more trained people, but then they lack an alternative vision.
So they're largely trained in a sort of standard neoclassical framework.
Yeah, I mean, with Tandika Mkandawira says it best. He once said to me, the Washington consensus died in Washington, but is still very much alive in Africa. And so most of our economists are trained in that tradition, have been funded by that tradition, right?
Yeah.
Much of the graduate training is funded by funders who believe in that tradition. So you have very little alternative thinking in economics as a profession occurring on the African continent or amongst African scholars.
So were you trained in a sort of neoclassical framework as well?
No, I was lucky.
How did you avoid it?
Because I just right at the beginning, I mean, I come to economics from a political background. So I didn't take economics as a technical subject, but rather wanting to understand inequality, which was something that disturbed me, from growing up and coming out of Kenya, which is probably one of the most unequal countries in the world. And so I was always looking for the alternative. I came looking for the alternative. And I only went into economics because that's a subject that supposedly would give me access to understanding why there's inequality. But even then, I was very conscious that, there was a mainstream way of thinking about things in the social sciences and alternative ways of thinking about things. So I went looking for the alternative.
But presumably a lot of Africans who did come into the neoclassical tradition would also come from, experiencing deep inequality as well.
Yes, but one can come from experiencing deep inequality, but not necessarily coming from a politicized understanding of deep inequality, is
right.
A. And B, it's easy enough to explain it in conventional ways. I mean, thinking of my own growing up. So let me tell you exactly, one of the things that struck me growing up. One of the things that struck me growing up was, first of all, there was kind of a belief in natural gifts for people. So that, people were naturally gifted, and there were kids who were intelligent and kids who weren't. So early on, that kind of was supposed to explain why people are unequal.
Right.
And then at some point, I noticed that, we called everybody who was a close friend of the family. If there were kids your age, we called them all cousins, whether they were really your cousins or not. But one of the things I noticed early on was, quote unquote, my cousins whose parents had done well could fail O levels or A levels, get to repeat them in good schools, and then be successful.
Right.
My peasant cousins were done for.
Right.
Right? My peasant cousins, who may have even done better than the quote unquote rich or connected cousins, were done for. And so I started questioning, wait a moment, this idea that it's native intelligence or anything just doesn't make sense, right? So that struck me very early on. And then just coming from a family which had been engaged in the freedom struggle in Kenya, which was about inequality in many ways, pushed me further to really try and look for what's the difference. Why is it that some people do well and some people don't do as well?
And so you had taken a different path, but as you said, the rest of your colleagues who were managing.
Right, and so for them, inequality could be explained in very standard ways. In some people, some people have the skills. Some people are naturally endowed with this. Standard story, some people work harder. Of course, the poor work harder than all of us, but
yes,
their rewards are not rewarded as highly.
No.
But
so they are able to. They're able to sort of.
Stories.
Sorry, that they're able to justify they're doing well and others are not doing well because they're obviously better.
Yeah, and it's a difficult position, difficult position to actually say that, to say to yourself that I'm here because I was somewhat lucky, right? Rather than it was on my own effort and I was lucky and I am an outcome of generations before me and luck, rather than my own hard work. So
Yeah.
people are quite happy to think that
Indeed.
success is simply their own hard work. And I'm not trying to diminish that people work hard. Yes, people work hard, but there's an incredible amount of luck as well, an incredible amount of social networks. And so in justifying one's own position, I think it becomes easy to accept kind of standard arguments about inequality, and that inequality is actually useful for growth.
Yes, that's true. So
Because
going back to the story, just to the third phase, we now have African economies benefiting again from high-priced commodities, and many more economists seeking to run the economies on the basis of neoclassical economics. So
yes,
where does this story go then?
Where does this story? So that for me is actually, in my classes, this is one of the things I pose, which is kind of, look, you had a first phase of growth, and that did not lead anywhere necessarily. So why should we expect that this present phase of growth will be much different than the outcomes of the first phase? And, this is something I am still exploring, but I actually don't think it's, on the margins, there are differences, but I don't think it's leading to somewhere that is different in a transformative sense.
Okay. And what would a transformative sense look like? What sort of transformation would you want for it?
In one in which, that many of these countries will then be able to sustain their growth without necessarily depending just on high commodity prices, for example.
Okay.
So that you have some kind of internal growth built into the process, and they're generating their own growth, or regardless of what worldwide conditions are, they grow at a significant rate. And so that has not occurred. I mean,
has it not occurred anywhere? Are there no examples?
I wouldn't say it's not occurred anywhere. I think Botswana is a country that one can think of that has grown and transformed to a certain extent. In fact, has been, I would say, at around 2000, I think in the 30 years up to 2000, Botswana had been the fastest growing economy across the world for 30 years.
Wow.
Which is not recognized.
No.
Is not recognized. But so Botswana is one. And there's an interesting story. It's still very minerally dependent, very much on minerals, with diamonds being important, but kind of a very clever sometimes sounds wrong, so I won't use clever, intelligent use of their natural resources, interesting public-private partnership between De Beers and the Botswana government in terms of mining and processing their diamonds, and an attempt to slowly transform their economy based on their diamond wealth. A very high commitment to education, health, and improving the infrastructure went along with this kind of retaining a hand on what is their national wealth, rather than just handing it over to a multinational to run.
And so have they managed to sort of reinvest then and build other industries, economy to escape the sort of the total dominance of the diamond industry?
No, I don't think they've completely managed that. I don't think they've completely managed that. I think the tourism sector has developed quite well alongside the diamond sector. But they have managed to educate their population, improve their health, and kind of build the basis potentially of then growing onward in the future. One of the things that was interesting about this growth has also been their dependence on something which I think is important, which was African expertise, right? I was very struck in when will this kind of late 90s, early 2000s, when this growth was really taking off and they were expanding their university, etc., how open they were, for example, to African intellectuals going to Botswana, African professionals, and willing to recruit rather than looking west for their expertise. So that was one thing that was very interesting about the Botswana case. That was different particularly during that period from other African countries.
So does this show more self-confidence in a way, and has this counteracted at all the sort of dominance of the neoclassical economists?
So I don't think it's countered the dominance of neoclassical economists. I do think it's shown more confidence. I think so. For a second, so there are two stories. I think one, if African countries had just followed some consistent policy, even if it was wrong, many of them may have done better than following, haphazardly following many different wrong policies.
Right.
Right. So, I think particularly during the structural adjustment period, there was a fair amount of inconsistency in terms of policy, both because of ideas and because of struggles over the policy. So I think consistency matters. So that has allowed Botswana then to have progress. I think the other bit is, you have a pretty consolidated Botswana elite that has not been challenged in terms of its leadership, and was not challenged during the colonial phase. Because Botswana, remember, has a different history, right? Botswana, actually, the elite come to England and say, hey, can we strike a deal because we want to be a protectorate because we're worried about South Africa.
All right.
So they, in that sense, they don't go through the same process as some other African elites. They're not destroyed. And so they have, I think, them able to manage the process much better than other African elites, in the sense that there isn't that struggle over new elites coming. Education goes to the same elites. So there is some kind of social compact that the old elites have about transforming that country and owning that country that allows them, I think, to build that country into what it is.
And so is it, what levels of inequality are in Botswana?
The levels of, what is surprising is that the levels of inequality are still high, but I think it's old hierarchies which are accepted.
Right. Okay. So yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So we don't really question the wealth of the queen.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Far be it from us to dare to question.
Yeah. Something. So we accept those hierarchies, and I think newer hierarchies which have inequality inequality producing are much more likely to be questioned.
Okay.
So yes, they're still highly unequal, but I think they're accepted, and unfortunately accepted inequalities.
So, but I suppose if I'm getting this right, the overall model was still sell commodities, which I suppose is, in tune with an idea of sort of free trade. This is your comparative advantage, etc. But and not having any sort of protection of infant industries or trying to sort of develop any transformative capacity, which would be in tune with the sort of dominant thinking.
No, that's completely right. I think until very recently, until the success of China, which just forced African leaders to rethink their position and to say, wait a minute, there's something we're missing out on. We had accepted kind of the World Bank arguments around comparative advantage and doubling down.
What difference has China made then?
Because you have an example that you can't ignore. So I think that there are two very important examples in kind of development thinking. I think in the early phase, Russia was extremely important in providing an alternative. In that African elite saw a country which, yes, though more advanced than them at the turn of the 20th century, was still predominantly an agricultural country. And by the time we get to the 60s, it's a superpower.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of, wow, you can do industrialization and you can do it like this. And here's a blueprint, right?
Right.
So there's national planning, focus on industry. There's a blueprint. And then we go through this period of neoliberalism and structural adjustment where people are convinced that stuff doesn't work. And people have started accepting it. And then China rises up. Okay?
Yeah.
And China it's interesting for me because, China's presence is larger than Japan's, right?
Yeah.
Japan was the second largest economy for a long while and did rise up in the same way. But because it just didn't have the presence that China has in terms of thinking of alternatives, in terms of thinking of a Chinese method, Chinese characteristics to development, or as they like saying, socialism with Chinese characteristics. So that helped people start to think, wait a moment, there is an alternative. And what we've been told is wrong is not necessarily wrong. Then, of course, China has come back and also, unlike Japan, which was constrained and tried to work through the Bretton Woods institutions, right? And I think you know about the debates around the East Asian model and how the World Bank pushed a particular view, and Japan actually gave money for the East Asian model to be explored. And then they started, they changed it to export-led, because the earlier view was it was just free markets. Then the World Bank said, okay, it was an export-led growth. But my understanding is that Japanese policymakers were frustrated by how development thinking was pushed as this kind of free trade, the free trade, free market kind of development versus what they actually did. But what China did, which was different, was not only did they provide a different model, but then they came back and said, and we're willing to help and fund different approaches. We're willing to support infrastructure. We're willing to give you loans at, you know, on different terms.
So just to, I mean, I suppose I had the impression that China wanted to use Africa as its source of minerals and food.
Yeah.
But they actually had an interest in the development, the sort of industrial development of Africa as well.
I'm, you know, so I can't tell. I don't know what the Chinese elite are actually thinking, but there is a history in which China supported attempts at African development and African liberation prior to this phase.
Right.
Right? So there's, at some level, some solidarity. And for, I think, older members of the Communist Party of China, or whatever has been passed on, there was a sense of seeing Africans as allies and not people we teach them.
Okay.
So I think that helps quite a bit in terms of then the interactions between African policymakers, African leaders, and Chinese leaders. So even where China is, of course, interested, has its own set of interests, right? It is looking for ways to feed its industries. It's looking for markets. So I don't think in that sense it's any different from any other country, but it's not coming at that from being a colonizing country. It's coming from that as being, you know, at least at some level, in the abstract, an equal, you know, an equal sovereign nation.
Yeah.
And so until, you know, until African countries kowtow, China is treating them as sovereign nations which have interests of their own.
But I suppose if African countries become increasingly indebted to China, then I suppose it's clear the sort of power relationships there.
Yeah, I mean, so I think China provides an alternative, but I think it's one that African countries need to carefully deal with.
Yeah.
Right? They need to figure out, okay, so we now have China, which has one particular view. You have Nordic countries which have a slightly different view. You have kind of the Anglo-Saxon world which has a particular view. You know, Germany's view is also slightly different. So,
yeah.
And you need to accept that these people have their own set of interests and you have your own set of interests, and you have to balance your interests against theirs, and also not to be completely indebted to any one of them such that that one has leverage over you.
And is there a potential for a more sort of pluralist understanding to emerge from this, with these different influences, and more of a sort of debate and dialogue rather than a sort of single one-size-fits-all?
I worry that with the exception of maybe a couple of countries, South Africa, maybe Senegal, I would say, I'm not so sure about Egypt and Sudan. Alternative thinking was killed off, but those were also places where there was, at least in the earlier phase, quite a bit of alternative thinking. I'm not very optimistic about the potential of real alternative thinking.
And what about, so looking forward, I suppose you've talked a lot about growth, but I suppose we're in a world of climate breakdown
Yeah.
and increasing threats, and I suppose maybe a pressure to reduce carbon and throughput of
Yeah.
commodities and so on. So what hope do you see moving forward?
Well, I think the challenge is to take those challenges and really integrate them into the African challenge of transforming one's economy. So rather, I think we've been, as African nations and developing nations are often stuck in this argument where there is a sense of where we did not destroy the earth, right? But but you want us to pay for the destruction, right? And I think that's right. But I think at the same time, it shouldn't stop them from individually trying to transform their economies. And this may be a strange thing to say, but take advantage of where they are to become greener. Since they're not so enmeshed in the coal economy, in the oil economy, to transform their energy networks to something different, right? To start and not try and replicate the old energy infrastructure, for example, but build new energy infrastructures. So I think that's a real challenge, and you've got to do as the Chinese say, walk with, do they say walking on two legs or something like that? Which is you've got to do both.
Yes, yeah.
You've got to hold the old industrial countries accountable for what they've done. But that doesn't mean that you don't transform your own economies to deal with the new challenge. And in fact, the transformation of your own economies to deal with the new challenges often produces products that then you can sell back to the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
I think of drip irrigation, right?
Yeah.
Israel faces a problem and its response is drip irrigation. Water saving toilets.
Yeah.
Australia faces a problem, its response is, so.
What's the African equivalent, do you think, that?
I don't know what the product is, right? I mean, we've seen some things. Okay, so you can think of clearly the one thing that strikes me straight away is kind of the failure of banks and the success of M-Pesa in the Kenyan context.
Right, that's the mobile
the money transfer system.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something. Unfortunately, Safaricom has not really, in a sense, owned that, right? So there's a lot of discussion about it, and there are ways in which Kenya's economy keeps transforming based on what M-Pesa does, but it's not been something that has actually been exported out of. Well, let me take that back. Maybe it's not been exported, but definitely a kind of a small ecosystem of producers of software and apps has been built around it. And so expanding that would be what I would say would be something that could be done, that comes out of that as an example.
Well, I'm going to have to let you go now, but I think it's good to end on that sort of positive example and hope that other transformative ideas can come out of newfound confidence, which you've been talking about.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, just before you go, because I don't want it to be limited to that one. I think there, just quickly, I think people need to take a closer look at African countries. There are very interesting things happening. For what, Rwanda in this same area is very interesting, and the connection between telephony and agriculture and health is another interesting thing. Nigeria and movies and Nollywood is something else. The informal industrial sector in Ghana, built out of the Swami market, is another area. So if we carefully celebrated African successes and shared them across the continent, I think there are a lot of lessons actually to be learned from African economies themselves for future growth and development.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mwangi. It's
Thanks,
been a pleasure.
Henry. Okay.